The black marble of the Palazzo Medici reflects the flickering candlelight like a pool of dark obsidian. Around the long table sit the heads of the 5 families. At the head sits Dante Medici. He is perfectly still, anchored by the heavy scent of aged leather, antique library cedar, and the cold smoke of a high-quality cigar. His right thumb slowly rotates his gold signet ring. He feels the worn crest of his ancestors against his skin. It is a quiet, terrifying gesture that always precedes either a miracle or a death sentence. In his other hand, he holds a solid gold pen, ready to sign a syndicate treaty. Then, a stranger walks into the lion's den. She moves through the armed guards like a shadow carried by the freezing wind of the Arno River. She leans down to the ear of the most dangerous man in Italy. She whispers a single, forbidden word. Marco. The gold pen slips from Dante's fingers, clattering against the cold stone. For the name of a ghost, the Mafia Boss was ready to burn the world alive. This is Sinful Loyalty Stories. The solid gold pen rolls across the black marble of the long table. It is a small sound, a subtle clatter of metal against polished stone. Yet, in the cavernous expanse of the great hall, it echoes with the deafening weight of a gunshot. The 5 most powerful men in Tuscany sit frozen in their high-backed chairs. They are men who dictate the flow of narcotics, weapons, and political favors across Europe. They are men who order executions over lukewarm espresso without a second thought. But right now, none of them dare to draw a full breath. The air in the room suddenly feels completely devoid of oxygen. It is heavy, anchored by Dante's signature scent, an authoritative, suffocating blend of aged leather from the chairs, the ancient cedar of the library walls, and the lingering cold smoke of a high-quality cigar. To speak that name in the Palazzo Medici is not a breach of etiquette. It is a signed death warrant. For 2 years, the name has been excised from the syndicate's vocabulary. It is a ghost locked away in the deepest, coldest vault of Dante Medici's mind. When the fever took his 4-year-old heir, it did not just take a child. It took the only remaining vulnerability, the only lingering warmth in the Don's soul. Dante had built an empire of absolute control. He owned the shipping routes. He owned the judges. He owned the shadows of Florence. But as he sat beside a small bed 2 years ago, watching his son burn from the inside out, he learned the bitter, devastating truth of his existence. He realized that a king's armor of wealth and violence is entirely useless against the invisible, indifferent forces of nature. A mafia don can bribe a witness, but he cannot bribe a thermometer. He can order a hit, but he cannot assassinate a fever. The profound helplessness of that loss calcified his heart into stone. This is why, every Friday at dawn, before the city fully wakes, Dante submits to his only remaining weakness. He rides alone in a black SUV to the Santa Croce cemetery. He leaves his armed guards at the iron gates. He walks through the morning fog, the bitter, unforgiving cold wind of the Arno River cutting through his heavy charcoal coat. He walks past the grand, towering mausoleums of historical figures and stops at a simple, small marble headstone. He kneels in the damp earth. He removes the heavy gold signet ring from his right hand. It is the only place on earth where he strips himself of his title, where he ceases to be the Lion of Florence. He places a small red toy car on the freezing stone. For 1 hour a week, he allows himself to be a father who failed. He sits in the silence of the dead, feeling the agonizing, crushing weight of absence. The cold marble offers no comfort, but it is the only physical connection he has left to the boy who was supposed to inherit his world. Then, when the hour is up, he puts the gold ring back on his finger. He stands up, locking the raw, bleeding grief behind a fortress of iron will, and returns to the palazzo to be the monster the syndicate requires him to be. But now, standing in the flickering candlelight of the great hall, that carefully constructed fortress has just been breached. The flickering light dances across the black marble, reflecting like a pool of dark obsidian. Dante does not reach for the weapon concealed beneath his tailored jacket. He does not shout for the guards stationed at the heavy oak doors. He slowly turns his head. The movement is fluid, unhurried, yet it carries the terrifying promise of absolute destruction. His dark eyes, the color of a winter storm, lock onto the woman standing beside him. She is a stranger. She wears a simple dark wool coat that holds the damp chill of the Florentine night. She does not belong in this room. She does not belong in a fortress guarded by 40 armed men. The guards at the entrance are already drawing their weapons, their faces pale with the horrifying realization that they allowed a civilian to walk directly up to the Don during a council meeting. Dante does not look at the guards. He raises his right hand, lifting his index finger a fraction of an inch. It is a silent, absolute command. The guards freeze mid-draw. The Dons at the table remain perfectly still, their eyes darting nervously between Dante and the intruder. Dante slowly rotates the gold signet ring on his fourth finger. He feels the worn, ancient crest of the Medici family against his calloused skin. It is a grounding technique, a desperate, microscopic friction required to keep the violent surge of his own blood from turning into immediate bloodshed. He studies the woman's face. She is not trembling. Her eyes are not wide with the cornered panic of an assassin who knows she is about to die. She meets the terrifying depth of his gaze with an impossible stillness. She looks at the most dangerous man in Italy, and she does not see a monster. She looks at him with a quiet, profound sorrow. Her dark eyes hold a depth of empathy, a specific kind of mercy that Dante has not seen since he watched the life leave his son's body. She did not shout the name as an insult. She whispered it as an offering. "Leave us." Dante's voice is a low rumble, barely above a whisper. The sound does not echo, but it hits the men at the table with the force of a physical blow. Romano, the silver-haired consigliere of the southern families, opens his mouth to protest the catastrophic breach of security protocol. He looks at the terrifying, cold absolute in Dante's eyes, and immediately closes it. The Dons stand up. They gather their coats in complete silence. They file out of the great hall, followed by the guards, the heavy mahogany doors pulling shut behind them with a muffled final thud. Within seconds, the vast, opulent room is empty, save for the King of Florence and the strange woman who just spoke the name of a ghost. The air is perfectly still. The only sound is the rain hitting the glass and the quiet, steady breathing of a woman who holds a secret that should have been buried 2 years ago.
The heavy mahogany doors click shut. The sound seals the great hall, trapping the two of them inside a cavern of shadows and candlelight. The black marble floor stretches between them, reflecting the flickering amber flames like a pool of dark obsidian. Outside, the relentless, freezing wind of the Arno River howls against the high arched windows, rattling the ancient glass. Inside, the silence is absolute. Dante Medici stands at the head of the long, empty table. He does not rush. He does not display the frantic, chaotic anger of a lesser man whose deepest wound has just been torn open. He studies the woman standing 20 feet away. She has not moved. Her dark wool coat is damp from the Florentine night. Her hands rest quietly at her sides. She is a civilian who just cleared a room of the most ruthless cartel bosses in Europe with a single, 5-letter word. Dante begins to walk toward her. His footfalls are slow, measured. The sound of his leather soles against the stone is a steady, terrifying metronome. As he closes the distance, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifts. The air grows heavy with his signature scent, the intimidating, dark blend of aged leather, the ancient cedar of the Palazzo's library, and the cold, lingering ghost of a high-quality cigar. He stops precisely 3 feet in front of her. He is a towering monolith of dark charcoal wool and suppressed violence. He looks down into her face. She tilts her head up to meet his gaze. The candlelight catches her eyes. They are a deep, fathomless brown, the color of wet earth after a storm. But it is not the color that makes the dawn of Florence freeze. It is the texture of her gaze. In her eyes, Dante does not see the reflection of his own power. He does not see the fear that every other living soul offers him. He sees a profound, quiet sorrow. He sees a specific, devastating mercy that he has entirely forgotten. The mercy of someone who knows what it means to sit in the dark and watch a life slip away. "Who sent you?" Dante asks. His voice is a low, vibrating rumble that barely disturbs the air, yet carries the lethal weight of a loaded weapon. "No one sent me, Don Medici," she replies. Her voice is soft, steady, carrying a natural melody that refuses to break under his intimidation. "My name is Bianca." Dante slowly rotates the gold signet ring on his right hand. The microscopic friction of the metal against his skin is the only thing tethering him to reality. "You spoke a name," Dante whispers, the words tasting like ash and poison in his mouth. "A name that does not exist in the city. A name that belongs to the earth." "It belongs to a boy." Bianca corrects him gently. It is a fatal risk, correcting the Lion of Florence, but she does not flinch. A boy who liked to count the stars through the window of the pediatric ward at Santa Maria Nuova. The mention of the hospital strikes Dante with the physical force of a hammer against his ribs. The memories he had spent 2 years burying in concrete suddenly breached the surface. The blinding, sterile white lights of the corridors. The sharp, chemical smell of antiseptic that could never mask the scent of sickness. The agonizing, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor that eventually slowed into a single, continuous, soul-crushing tone. "You were a nurse," Dante states. It is not a question. He remembers the rotation of the staff. He remembers the blue scrubs. He remembers the faces that looked at him with pity, faces he had banished from his sight the moment Marco took his last breath. "I was his primary care nurse during the night shifts," Bianca says, her voice dropping to a whisper of profound reverence. "I sat with him when the fever was at its highest. I held his hand when you were forced to step out to speak with the doctors." Dante's jaw locks. The muscles in his neck pull tight. He wants to order her thrown into the freezing Arno. He wants to erase her from existence for daring to bring these images back into his mind. But he does not, because she did not break into a mafia fortress simply to reminisce. 2 years have passed, Dante says, his tone turning to ice. "If you came to offer condolences, you are inexcusably late. And if you came to extort me with the memory of my son, you will not leave this room breathing."
Bianca does not step back. She absorbs the threat with that same, impossible mercy in her eyes. It did not come for money, she says. It came because he made a promise. And it came because it is finally safe to keep it. Slowly deliberately, so as not to trigger the lethal instincts of the man standing before her, Bianca reaches her right hand into the deep pocket of her dup wool coat. Dante waits her hand. Retracts the movement with the cold precision of an apex predator. If she draws a weapon, she will be dead before the barrel clears the fabric. She pulls her hand out, her fingers are curled around a small object. She opens her palm, holding it out under the amber glow of the near chandelier. Dante stops breathing. The entire architecture of his reality shatters into dust. Resting on her pale palm is a small, hand-carved wooden lion. The man is legal shipped on the left side. The wood is darkened by the natural oils of a small hand that had gripped it together for weeks. It is Marco's lion. Dante had commissioned it from a master woodworker in Tuscany when Marco was born. It was the boy's favorite toy. He refused to sleep without it when the fever finally broke the boy's body. Dante had personally placed that wooden lion into Marco's small, cold hands as he lay in the velvet lined casket. Dante had watched the eyelid close over it. He had watched the casket lowered into the earth at Santa Croce. The lion was buried. Yet here it is. Dante reaches out his large, scarred hand trembles, a microscopic betrayal of the iron control he has maintained his entire life. He picks up the small wooden figure from her palm. He stun brushes over the shipped mané. It is exactly as he remembers. The weight, the texture, the undeniable authenticity of the object. How, Dante breathes. The word is completely hollow, stripped of all authority, reduced to the raw, blade in confusion of a father staring at an impossibility. He gave it to me, Bianca whispers, a single tear finally breaking free and tracing a silver line down her cheek. On his final night, before the fever took his consciousness completely. He asked me to eat it. He was buried with it, Dante argues, his voice rising a fraction, a crack appearing in the ice. I placed it in his hands myself. You placed it in his hands, Bianca not slowly. But it did not go into the earth, Don Medici. The Undertaker on the Medici payroll was paid to replace it with a perfect replica before the casket was sealed. The silence that follows is the heaviest thing Dante has ever felt. It is the silence of a vacuum right before a catastrophic explosion. His sons the death was compromised. The final, sacred ritual of a grieving father was violated. Why would Marco give this to you? Dante asked, his voice dropping into a register of pure, terrifying darkness. Why would a 4-year-old boy ask a narcitoid his most prized possession? Bianca looks at him. The mercy in her eyes ardens into the fierce, protective resolve of a woman who has carried a dangerous secret for entirely too long. Because he was 4 years old, Don Medici, but he was still your blood, Bianca says, the words hanging in the cold air. He knew someone was in the room who did not belong there. He told me he had to eat the lion so the bad man would take it. He told me to keep it safe until his papa came to find me. Dante stands frozen, the wooden toy burning against his palm like a coal pulled directly from the fire. The bad man, Marco had died of a fever. The doctors had confirmed it. The specialist flowing from Switzerland had confirmed it was an aggressive, unstoppable infection. There were no assassins. There was no poison. But someone had paid the Undertaker to steal a wooden toy. Someone had sotted in the shadows of the pediatric ward, freeing a dying child enough that he felt he had to eat his only comfort. Dante looks at the small, sheeped lion. Then he looks at Bianca. Why did you wait 2 years to bring this to me? Dante asks. The question is a loaded gun. Because the man who sotted in the shadows of the hospital room, Bianca whispers, her gaze darting toward the Ave Mahogany doors where the syndicate bosses had dashed it. The man who paid the Undertaker, he told me that if he ever approached you, he would ensure you suffered the exact same fever your son did. Dante's tongue stops moving over the wooden man. His grief is gone. The mausoleum he had built around his heart fractures and collapses, instantly replaced by a blinding, absolute, and utterly ruinous rage. His son was not murdered, but his son was wounded, even as he was dying. Dante Medici closes his fist around the wooden lion. He does not yell. He does not break the glass on the table. He simply accepts the truth. The ghost has finally spoken, and Dante is going to burn the world to the ground to answer him.
The heavy mahogany doors of the Great Hall remain closed. Dante Medici does not immediately summon his guards. He does not order a citywide lockdown. He stands in the flickering candlelight, the chipped wooden lion clutched so tightly in his massive fist that the edges bite into his calloused palm. A lesser man would have torn the palazzo apart. A lesser man would have dragged the 5 syndicate bosses back into the room and interrogated them at gunpoint. But Dante is not a creature of impulse. He is the architect of a dark empire, and he knows that panic is the loudest confession a man can make. He looks at Bianca. She is still standing in the center of the room, her damp coat absorbing the chill of the black marble. She has handed him the impossible. She has handed him a piece of his dead son. "Come with me," Dante commands softly. He turns and walks toward the private corridors of the West Wing. He does not check to see if she follows. He knows she will. A woman who walks into a Mafia council meeting with a ghost's secret has long since abandoned the instinct to run. He leads her to the private library. It is a room of deep shadows, towering oak bookshelves, and the heavy scent of old paper and leather bindings. He gestures to a high-backed velvet chair near the unlit fireplace. "Sit," he says. His voice is flat, devoid of the crushing intimidation he uses on his enemies, but it leaves no room for debate. Bianca sits. She folds her hands in her lap, looking impossibly small against the grandeur of the Medici estate. Dante steps back out into the corridor. The heavy door clicks shut, locking her inside. It is a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. She will not leave until he knows exactly the anatomy of the secret she carries. He walks to his study. The amber light from his desk lamp casts long, imposing shadows. He picks up the secure internal phone and presses a single button. "Luca," Dante says into the receiver. The word is barely a breath, but it carries the weight of a falling guillotine. "Yes, Don." Luca answers instantly. "I need the hospital records from Santa Maria Nuova. Pediatric ward. 2 years ago. November." Dante's voice is a low, vibrating hum. "Find the file for a nurse named Bianca. And find the banking records of the undertaker who prepared Marco for burial. Bring them to my study now." 10 minutes pass. The silence in the palazzo is suffocating. Outside, the Tuscan rain continues to lash against the glass, a relentless assault that mirrors the storm building inside Dante's chest. He stands by the window, staring out into the black courtyard. He holds the wooden lion in his left hand, his thumb tracing the chipped mane over and over again. It is a tactile anchor, preventing him from drowning in the sheer, violent rage that threatens to consume him. The heavy oak door of the study opens. Luca enters, holding a thin manila folder. The investigator's face is a mask of absolute, professional neutrality, but the slight tension in his shoulders betrays his unease. He knows the Don is pulling at a thread that was buried 2 years ago. "Bianca Rossi," Luca begins, stepping into the amber light and placing the open folder on the mahogany desk. She was a senior pediatric nurse at Santa Maria Nuova. Impeccable record. No criminal ties. No debts. Dante turns away from the window. He walks to the desk, his dark eyes scanning the glowing white pages in the dim light. "And her current status?" Dante asks, his voice like grinding stones. "That is where the anomaly begins," Luca replies, pointing to a stark, bureaucratic timestamp on the second page. She resigned from her position exactly 48 hours after Marco's funeral. She abandoned a decade-long career overnight. She moved to a small, isolated village in the Apennines. She practically erased herself from the world. Dante absorbs the information. A woman does not erase herself without a catalyst. She erases herself because she is hunted. "The undertaker," Dante whispers, the word tasting like poison. Luca flips to the next page. A bank statement. Aldo Vieri, the man who prepared the casket. 3 days before the funeral, a deposit of 50,000 euros was wired into a shell account under his wife's maiden name. It was routed through 3 different offshore entities, but the origin traces back to a holding company controlled by the Southern families. The first wave of revelation crashes through the quiet study. The Southern families. The men who had just been sitting at Dante's table in the Great Hall. The men who had offered him their hollow condolences while secretly violating his son's deathbed. "Where is Vieri now?" Dante asks, his jaw locking so tightly the bone threatens to crack. "He is dead, Don Dante," Luca says quietly. 3 weeks after the deposit, he was struck by a commercial transport truck on a rural road outside Siena. The police ruled it a hit and run. The driver was never found. Dante closes his eyes. The architecture of the betrayal is perfectly clear. It is the classic, ruthless methodology of the syndicate. Pay a man to commit a sin, and then kill him to bury the receipt. "They paid the undertaker to steal the toy," Dante says, his voice dropping into a register of pure, terrifying darkness. "And they threatened the nurse to ensure she never spoke of what happened in that hospital room." Luca looks at the wooden lion in Dante's hand. He realizes the magnitude of what the Don is holding. "Why, sir? Why would the Southern families care about a wooden toy?" Marco passed from a fever. It was a tragedy, not a hit. There was no foul play in his death. Dante opens his eyes. They are the color of a tempest, dark and violent. "Because the toy is not what they were afraid of," Dante whispers. He looks down at the chipped mane of the wooden lion. A 4-year-old boy does not understand the complexities of mafia politics, but a child understands fear. A child understands when a shadow in the room does not belong to a doctor. Dante leaves the files on the desk. He walks past Luca, his stride long and purposeful, his dark charcoal suit absorbing the ambient light of the corridor. He returns to the West Wing library. He pushes the heavy door open. Bianca is still sitting in the velvet chair. She looks up at him, her dark, sorrow-filled eyes meeting his. She sees the storm brewing behind his unreadable mask. She knows he has verified her identity. Dante walks toward her. He stops, towering over the small woman, casting her entirely in his shadow. "The Undertaker is dead," Dante states. The words are absolute, carrying the chill of the grave. "He was murdered 3 weeks after my son's funeral. The men who paid him covered their tracks." Bianca swallows hard. Her pale hands grip the fabric of her coat. "I know. I saw the news. That is why I ran to the mountains." "You said a man stood in the shadows of the hospital room." Dante continues, his voice lowering, the interrogation tightening like a noose. "You said he threatened you with the same fever that took Marco." "He wore a dark suit," Bianca says, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze never leaving Dante's face. "He smelled of expensive cologne and stale smoke. He wore a silver pin on his lapel. A falcon." Dante stops breathing. The Falcone family, the primary allies of Romano, the silver-haired consigliera who had just been sitting at the council table. "He told me that if I ever spoke your name or approached the palazzo, I would not live to see the morning," Bianca whispers. Dante slowly rotates the gold signet ring on his finger. The puzzle pieces are sliding into place, forming a picture of profound, agonizing betrayal. But there is still one piece missing, the most important piece. "A man of the Falcone family does not risk my wrath to steal a piece of wood," Dante says, his tone dangerously calm. He holds up the wooden lion. "You risked your life to bring this to me today. Why? After 2 years of hiding, why walk into the lion's den now?" Bianca looks at the wooden toy in Dante's massive hand. The second wave of revelation hangs in the air, heavy and absolute. "Because the man with the silver falcon died yesterday," Bianca says, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "I saw his obituary in the Florentine papers. The man who threatened me is gone. The contract on my silence expired." Dante watches her. He waits. He knows there is more. "And because," Bianca continues, her voice finally breaking, "the lion was just the vessel, Don Medici." Dante frowns infinitesimally. He looks down at the wooden toy. "Marco didn't just ask me to hide his toy," Bianca whispers, tears spilling over her eyelashes, falling onto the dark wool of her coat. "He knew he was leaving. He knew you were breaking. He made me write something down. He dictated a message for you, Don Medici. He made me swear on my soul that I would deliver it to you when the bad men were gone." The silence in the library becomes a physical entity. It presses against Dante's chest, threatening to shatter his ribs. His dead son left a message. And this stranger, this ordinary nurse from a public hospital, had carried the ghost's final words through 2 years of terror, waiting for the exact moment she could return them to the king. The silence in the private library is absolute. It is a heavy, physical entity that presses against the ancient oak bookshelves and settles deep into the marrow of Dante Medici's bones. His dead son left a message. For 2 years, Dante had believed that Marco's final hours were a void of delirium and pain, a tragic fade into nothingness that he had been powerless to stop. He had tortured himself with the memory of the sterile hospital room, the rhythmic, agonizing beep of the monitors, and the profound, crushing quiet that followed. He had believed the boy took his final thoughts with him into the dark. He was wrong. Dante stands perfectly still. He is a monolith of dark charcoal wool and suppressed violence. His right hand still grips the chipped wooden lion. His left hand slowly falls to his side. He looks down at Bianca. She is trembling, not from the freezing dampness of her coat, but from the immense, terrifying gravity of what she is about to do. She is a civilian standing in the center of the Medici fortress, preparing to hand the most dangerous man in Italy the only thing he cannot control. With slow, deliberate movements, Bianca reaches her hand into the inner lining of her dark wool coat. She feels along the seam near her heart. She finds the small, hidden opening she had sewn shut 2 years ago in a freezing apartment in the Apennines. Her pale fingers pull at the dark thread. It snaps with a soft, distinct sound. Dante watches her hands. He does not rush her. He does not demand she hand it over. He is caught in a paralyzing suspension of time, watching this woman unearth a ghost. Bianca withdraws a small, folded piece of paper. It is ordinary, light blue hospital stationery. The edges are worn, softened by time and the friction of being carried against her chest for 730 days. It is a fragile, insignificant scrap of paper that holds more power over the dawn of Florence than the combined wealth of the 5 families sitting in his great hall. She holds it out to him. Her hand shakes, but her dark eyes remain locked on his face, steady and full of that devastating, impossible mercy. Dante reaches for it. His large, calloused fingers that have signed death warrants, dismantled empires, and fired weapons without a tremor, hesitate for a microscopic fraction of a second before touching the paper. He takes it from her palm. The paper feels impossibly light. It carries the faint scent of her cheap lavender soap, mixed with a sterile, haunting memory of antiseptic. Dante turns away from her. He walks slowly toward the heavy mahogany desk resting near the unlit fireplace. The amber light from the brass reading lamp spills across the polished wood, creating a solitary island of illumination in the dark room. He stops at the edge of the light. He looks down at the folded blue paper. He rotates the gold signet ring on his right hand. A single, slow turn. The worn crest of his ancestors grinds against his skin. It is the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. With agonizing care, Dante unfolds the paper. The handwriting is neat, precise, written in dark blue ink. It is Bianca's handwriting, but the cadence, the syntax, the absolute innocence of the words belong entirely to a 4-year-old boy. Dante begins to read. To Papa. The breath leaves Dante's lungs. It is not a sigh. It is a violent, sudden evacuation of air, as if he has been struck in the chest by a heavy caliber round. The nurse says I have to sleep soon. The medicine makes my eyes heavy, but the men in the hallway are loud. The man with the silver bird is angry. Dante's jaw locks. The bone threatens to crack under the pressure. The man with the silver bird. Falcone's lieutenant. They were not just waiting for the boy to die. They were pacing the halls, intimidating the medical staff, bringing the ugly, ruthless pressure of the syndicate into the sacred, final hours of an innocent child. They had poisoned Marco's last moments with fear. Dante forces his eyes to the next line. I gave the nurse my lion. The bad men want to take things, but they cannot have him. He is brave. A phantom pain tears through Dante's chest. His son, his 4-year-old heir, burning with a lethal fever, using his final moments of lucidity to protect a wooden toy from the monsters circling his bed. Marco had recognized the darkness. He had recognized the predators his father had spent a lifetime trying to shield him from. Dante's thumb grips the edge of the paper. The blue ink seems to blur for a fraction of a second. Papa is sad. He holds my hand too tight. He looks at the window, but he doesn't see the outside. Dante closes his eyes. The memory is a physical weight. He remembers staring at the Florentine skyline through the hospital glass, calculating which doctor to bribe, which specialist to threaten, desperate to find a violent solution to a biological failure. He had been so consumed by his inability to conquer the fever that he had forgotten to simply be a father. Marco had felt that absence. Dante opens his eyes. He reads the final paragraph. It is written slightly smaller, as if Bianca had been rushing to capture the words before the boy's consciousness faded completely. Tell Papa not to be sad when I sleep. Tell him I am not scared of the dark. Tell him he has to stop looking at the window. Tell Papa to see the sun again. I don't want him to sit in the cold anymore. The letter ends. There is no signature, just the quiet, devastating finality of a child's last wish. Dante Medici does not weep. He does not collapse. Men of his architecture do not break outwardly. When they shatter, the destruction is entirely internal, a catastrophic implosion that leaves nothing but a terrifying, hollow void waiting to be filled with fire. He lowers the paper. The blue hospital stationery rests gently on the mahogany desk, directly beneath the amber light. He places the chipped wooden lion right next to it. The silence in the library is absolute. The relentless drumming of the Tuscan rain against the high-arched windows is swallowed by the sheer atmospheric pressure radiating from the dawn. Dante stares at the letter. Tell Papa to see the sun again. For 2 years, Dante had lived in a self-imposed winter. He had turned the Palazzo Medici into a tomb. He had severed every emotional tie, operating with the cold, mechanical ruthlessness of a machine. He believed he was honoring his son's memory by refusing to find warmth in a world that Marco no longer inhabited. But Marco had not wanted a mausoleum. Marco had wanted his father to step out of the dark. The profound, agonizing beauty of the boy's final wish clashes violently with the horrifying reality of what the syndicate had done to suppress it. Dante lifts his head. He looks across the dim room at Bianca. She is still sitting in the velvet chair. She looks small, exhausted, and entirely civilian. She does not own a gun. She does not command an army. She has no wealth, no political leverage, no violent reputation to protect her. Yet, this ordinary woman had looked at a dying boy and made a promise. And when a ruthless mafia lieutenant with a silver falcon pin had threatened her life, she had not destroyed the letter. She had not sold the secret to the highest bidder. She had sewn the words of a child into the lining of her coat, abandoned her entire existence, and lived in exile for 2 years. She had endured the cold, the poverty, and the suffocating, daily terror of being hunted by the Italian mafia, all to protect the final wish of a boy who was not her own. Dante thinks of the men sitting in the Great Hall just 20 minutes ago. Men who swore blood oaths of loyalty. Men who kissed his ring and called him brother. Men who, at the very first opportunity, had paid an undertaker to steal from a corpse and threatened a nurse to bury a secret, simply to exploit Dante's grief for their own political gain. The contrast is staggering. The syndicate's loyalty is a transaction, bought with fear and paid in blood. Bianca's loyalty is absolute. It is a terrifying, pure devotion that defies logic and demands reverence. Dante takes a slow, deep breath. The scent of ancient cedar, aged leather, and his own cold smoke fills his lungs. The grief that has paralyzed him for 2 years finally burns away, incinerated by a sudden, diamond-hard clarity. He is no longer a grieving father sitting in the cold. He is the Lion of Florence, and he has just been awakened. Dante looks at Bianca. His dark, tempestuous eyes lock onto hers.
He does not speak.
He does not need to. His silence was no longer the quiet of a tomb. It was the weight of a storm about to fall on whoever had silenced her. The amber light in the private library casts a long, unbroken shadow of Dante Medici across the floor. He stands by the mahogany desk, the blue hospital stationery resting under the glow of the brass lamp, next to the chipped wooden lion. The storm that had raged inside his chest for 2 years has not vanished, but its nature has fundamentally changed. It is no longer a chaotic, suffocating grief. It is a refined, weaponized clarity. He turns his head, his dark eyes settling on Bianca. The man with the silver falcon pin, Dante says, his voice a low, perfectly controlled vibration in the quiet room. A lieutenant of the Falcone family does not act unilaterally. He does not threaten a civilian and orchestrate the theft of a grave without explicit permission from a higher authority. He was a weapon. I need to know who aimed him. Bianca meets his gaze. The exhaustion in her small frame is evident, but the iron will that kept her alive for 2 years remains unbending. He was not the one who spoke first, Bianca reveals, her voice steady. Before the man with the falcon pin stepped out of the shadows to threaten me, another man entered the pediatric ward. An older man. He had silver hair and wore a dark suit tailored impeccably. He smelled of myrrh and cold rain. Dante stops breathing. The description is a flawless, undeniable portrait of Romano, his own consigliere, the man who had sat at his right hand for a decade. He did not threaten me initially. Bianca continues, the memory chilling the air around her. He opened a leather briefcase. He showed me stacks of bundled euros. He offered me $500,000 to hand over the blue paper and the wooden lion. He said that a king cannot be burdened by the sentimental whispers of a dying child. He said Florence needed a monster, not a mourning father. The final piece of the architecture of betrayal slides into place. Romano had seen Dante's grief not as a tragedy, but as a political vulnerability. The consigliera had sought to manipulate the Don's mourning, ensuring that no message of warmth, no plea to see the sun again, would ever reach Dante's hands. Romano had wanted to forge Dante into a ruthless, unfeeling weapon for the syndicate's benefit, and he had violated a child's deathbed to do it. When I refused the money, Bianca whispers, Romano closed the briefcase. He nodded to the man with the silver falcon. And then he walked away. He left me to the wolves. Dante's thumb slowly rotates the gold signet ring on his fourth finger. The profound, nauseating depth of the treason requires a specific kind of response. It requires a justice so absolute, so entirely devoid of emotion, that it will be whispered about in the dark corners of Italy for the next century. Dante looks at the heavy oak door. Luca, Dante says softly. The investigator steps into the library instantly, having stood guard in the corridor. Yes, Don Dante. The syndicate bosses, Dante states, his voice flat, mechanical. Did they leave the estate? No, sir, Luca replies. Protocol during an interrupted council dictates they wait in the East Wing anteroom until formally dismissed. Bring Romano and the current head of the Falcone family back to the Great Hall, Dante commands. Ensure the others remain in the anteroom. Do not draw your weapons. Simply invite them. Luca nods and vanishes into the corridor. Dante looks back at Bianca. Stay here. He picks up the chipped wooden lion and the folded blue paper. He walks out of the library, navigating the shadowy corridors of the palazzo with the terrifying, silent grace of a predator returning to its hunting ground. When Dante pushes open the heavy mahogany doors of the Great Hall, the room is exactly as he left it. The candlelight flickers against the black marble walls. The long, obsidian table reflects the amber flames. Romano and Don Falcone are already standing near the head of the table. They look composed, wearing the masks of concerned brothers, completely unaware that they are standing in an abattoir. Dante walks to the head of the table. He does not sit. He looks at the two men. Don Dante, Romano begins, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced cadence of a seasoned diplomat. We were deeply concerned by the interruption. The woman, clearly, she was unstable. A breach of security that we must address immediately. Dante does not answer. He slowly raises his left hand and places the small, chipped wooden lion on the black marble. The dull click of the wood against the stone echoes in the vast room. Falcone frowns, confused by the object. But Romano's eyes dart to the toy. For a microscopic fraction of a second, the silver-haired consigliera's pristine composure cracks. His pupil dilates. His jaw tightens. It is the faintest, most silent confession of guilt, but to Dante, it is as loud as a siren. Dante reaches into his jacket. He withdraws the worn, folded piece of blue hospital stationery. He places it next to the lion. 2 years ago, Dante says, his voice a low, resonant cello note echoing in the empty hall. My son lay dying in a sterile room. I stepped out to speak with the doctors. In that brief window, a man walked into the ward and offered a nurse €500,000 to destroy a letter written by a 4-year-old boy. The air in the Great Hall turns to ice. Falcone shifts his weight, looking at Romano, a sudden dawn of panic breaking across his face. He realizes his family's lieutenant was involved in something that Falcone himself might not have fully authorized, or worse, something he thought had been permanently buried. Romano stands perfectly still. He is a veteran of 1,000 betrayals. He calculates the angles. He realizes the nurse did not die. He realizes the paper survived. Dante, Romano says, his voice dropping the diplomatic pretense, taking on a tone of desperate, twisted justification. You were breaking. The boy's death was going to ruin you. You were ready to tear the city apart. That letter, the sentimentality in it, it would have made you weak. The 5 families needed the Lion of Florence. We needed a leader of iron, not a man weeping over a piece of blue paper. It is a stunning display of arrogance. The villain attempts to wrap his treason in the flag of loyalty, believing that the Mafia's code of absolute ruthlessness will shield him from a father's wrath. Dante simply looks at him. The Don does not yell. He does not reach for his weapon. His calm is absolute, profound, and deeply terrifying. He analyzes the anatomy of Romano's error like a coroner studying a fatal wound. "You believed that severing my connection to my son would make me a better king," Dante whispers. The sound is like a blade sliding across a whetstone. "You believed that true power requires the absence of a heart. You do not understand the architecture of this empire, Romano." Dante takes a slow step back from the table. "A king without a heart is merely a butcher," Dante continues softly. "And a man who threatens a nurse and steals from a dying child is not a brother. He is an infection." Romano opens his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer a new deal. Dante raises his right hand, rotating his signet ring once. From the shadows of the high arches, Luca and 4 elite Medici guards step forward. Their movements are completely synchronized, entirely silent. They hold suppressed weapons. "Don Dante, wait." Falcone chokes out, raising his hands. "You allowed your lieutenant to hunt a civilian for 2 years to cover this sin," Dante says, his gaze fixed on the black marble floor. "Your ignorance is just as fatal as his ambition." Dante turns his back to the men. He begins to walk toward the heavy mahogany doors. He does not watch. He does not need to. The low, muffled thuds of the suppressed weapons sound like heavy books dropping onto a carpet. There are no screams. The Medici guards are professionals. The execution is swift, clinical, and devoid of any passion. By the time Dante's hand touches the brass handle of the door, Romano and Falcone have been permanently removed from existence. "Burn the bodies," Dante says to Luca without looking back, "and prepare the East Wing anteroom. The remaining 3 Dons will require a new treaty." Dante pulls the door open and steps back out into the corridor. He walks back to the private library. The heavy atmosphere of the palazzo has shifted. The air feels cleaner, purged of a rot that had festered for 2 years. He enters the library. Bianca is still sitting in the velvet chair. She looks at his face, searching for the violent monster she had been warned about. She finds only the quiet, devastating calm of a father who has finally laid his son's ghost to rest. "The men who threatened you no longer exist," Dante says. The statement is simple, carrying the absolute finality of a law of physics. Bianca releases a breath she seems to have held for 2 years. Her shoulders drop. The crushing weight of the hunted falls away. "You are free to leave," Dante continues, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the massacre he just orchestrated. "Luca will provide you with a secure vehicle, unlimited funds, and a new identity anywhere in the world. You have returned my son to me. There is no debt you owe this family." Bianca looks down at her hands. She thinks of the isolated village in the mountains. She thinks of the terrible, lonely silence of running. Then she looks up at the towering, dark figure of Dante Medici. "I have nowhere to go, Don Dante," she whispers. "I abandoned my life to protect him. I have nothing left to return to." Dante studies her. He looks at the woman who possessed a loyalty stronger than the blood oaths of Mafia Dons. He looks at the civilian who walked into a room of murderers armed with nothing but a promise to a dead child. In the ruthless hierarchy of the Italian syndicate, the consigliere is the second most powerful position. It is the seat at the right hand of the king. It is the voice of reason, the keeper of secrets, and the conscience of the empire. Romano had defiled that seat. Dante slowly extends his right hand toward her. "Then do not return," Dante says softly. Bianca looks at his heavy, scarred hand. She looks at the gold signet ring. "The seat at my right hand is currently empty," Dante says, his voice vibrating with the weight of a profound, impossible offer. "My council is filled with men who calculate power in bullets and euros. They're butchers. I require someone who calculates power in loyalty. I require someone who remembers the weight of a wooden lion." Bianca's breath catches. He is not offering her a job. He is offering her the symbolic throne of the Medici family. He is elevating a nurse to the highest echelon of the criminal underworld, simply because she proved to be the only pure soul in Florence. "I am not a killer, Don Medici," she says, her voice trembling at the magnitude of the offer. "I have an army of killers," Dante replies, his dark eyes entirely sincere. "I do not need another gun. I need the woman who kept my son's memory alive in the dark. I need the voice of my conscience." Bianca looks at his extended hand. She thinks of the blue paper. She thinks of Marco's wish. "Tell Papa to see the sun again." She raises her pale hand and places it firmly in his. Dante's fingers close around hers. It is not a grip of violence. It is an anchor. "Welcome to the Palazzo Medici, Bianca," Dante whispers. "The king has stepped out of the cold, and the empire will never be the same." Dawn breaks over the city of Florence. The violent Tuscan storm has finally exhausted itself, leaving the cobblestone streets slick and shining under the pale morning light. The Arno River runs heavy and black, carrying the debris of the night out toward the sea. Inside the Palazzo Medici, the silence has fundamentally changed. It is no longer the suffocating, heavy quiet of a mausoleum. It is the steady, rhythmic silence of a fortress that has just been cleansed of its rot. The Great Hall is immaculate. The black marble floors have been polished. There is no physical evidence that the Consigliere of the South and the Don of the Falcone family were erased from existence just hours ago. In the criminal underworld, vacuums of power are usually filled with chaos. But Dante Medici does not permit chaos. He had summoned the 3 remaining Dons from the anteroom, presented them with the new borders of their territories, and sent them home with a terrifying understanding of what happens to men who attempt to manipulate a king's grief. Dante stands in his private study. He does not wear his heavy charcoal suit jacket. His white dress shirt is unbuttoned at the collar. He looks out the high-arched window, watching the first, fragile rays of sunlight pierce the heavy gray clouds over the city. "Tell Papa to see the sun again." He slowly turns away from the glass. He walks toward his mahogany desk. For 2 years, the 3 silver frames holding Marco's photographs were the only testament to the boy's existence in this room. They were shrines to a painful past. Now, resting directly beneath the amber glow of the brass reading lamp, sits the chipped wooden lion. Beneath it, carefully pressed flat under a heavy piece of protective glass, is the blue hospital stationery. Dante rests his fingertips on the cool glass, directly over his son's words. Men build empires on the illusion of control. They demand blood oaths in dark rooms. They buy loyalty with briefcases of euros and enforce it with the barrel of a gun. Romano and Falcone had sworn their lives to the Medici crest. They had kissed Dante's ring and called him a brother. And yet, the moment they saw an opportunity to forge him into a weapon of their own design, they had betrayed him entirely. Their loyalty was a transaction, a fragile contract written in disappearing ink. But true loyalty is not a contract. It is not born of fear or ambition. True devotion is a civilian woman sewing a dying child's secret into her coat and walking into exile. It is the willingness to sacrifice your entire existence to protect the memory of a boy who cannot offer you anything in return. Loyalty to the dead had saved the king of the living. 2 floors below, in a newly secured suite overlooking the private gardens, Bianca sleeps. She is exhausted, her small frame finally surrendering to the safety of the Medici walls. She does not fully comprehend the magnitude of the earthquake she has just caused in the Italian underworld. She went to sleep a fugitive nurse and woke up as the conscience of the most powerful crime syndicate in Europe. But an earthquake is never confined to a single city. The tremors are already spreading south. 300 miles away, in a sun-drenched villa overlooking the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast, a phone rings on a glass table. Don Vincenzo Ricci sits on a white leather sofa, smoking a thin, dark cigarette. He is a man of a different generation, a predator who built his fortune on the brutal, old-world tactics of extortion and terror. He does not hide in the shadows. He believes power should be loud, bloody, and absolute. He picks up the phone. He listens to the voice on the other end for a long, silent minute. "Romano is dead," Ricci murmurs, his voice a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper against wood. Falcone is gone, and Medici has given the consigliera's chair to a nurse. Ricci takes a slow drag of his cigarette. He exhales the smoke into the warm coastal air. A slow, cruel smile spreads across his weathered face. In Ricci's mind, the Lion of Florence has not awakened. He believes Dante has finally cracked under the weight of his grief. To elevate a civilian, a woman with no blood ties and no capacity for violence, to the right hand of the throne is not a strategic maneuver. It is an act of profound, sentimental madness. Medici has lost his mind, Ricci says into the receiver, crushing the cigarette into an ashtray. He thinks he can replace an army with a bleeding heart. He has left the gates wide open. Ricci stands up. He looks out at the endless blue horizon of the sea. Gather the capos, Ricci commands softly. The north is weak. It is time to remind Florence what true monsters look like. He hangs up the phone. The old guard of the south is preparing to march. They believe Dante is vulnerable. They believe Bianca is a liability that will cause the Medici Empire to collapse from within. They do not realize that Dante Medici is no longer sitting in the cold. He is standing in the light. And a king who fights to protect a pure soul is infinitely more dangerous than a butcher who fights only for himself. If loyalty is your only code, you belong here. Subscribe to the Empire. Stay loyal.